Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this morning's webinar on decarbonisation of heat within a net zero context. I want to move on to the framework slide. Whilst I'm waiting for the slide to move, okay, I understand. Housekeeping. So the timing of the webinar is due to last an hour and a half, so scheduled to finish for 11:30. But if we finish earlier, that's fine. And with regards to questions, there's a Q&A tab. If you can post any questions you have on there, and we'll deal with as many of those as we can when we right at the end of the session, if that suits everyone. We'll also distribute those questions and answers in the next day or so following the presentation, and we'll also forward a copy of the slides that you're going to see today. Joining me today are my colleague Simon Matthews, Principal Consultant at JRP with many years of experience. I've known Simon for over 30 years, and George Barnes, who's been at JRP man and boy, again, very well qualified, lots of experience. Unfortunately, Owen Jones can't join us today, but Rob will be handling the questions right at the end of the webinar. Can we move on to the framework, please? Excellent. So I'm going to do a brief introduction and set some context for today's webinar, and then Simon, I'll hand over to Simon, who will talk about the commercial influences, and before handing over to George Barnes, who's going to get into the real meat of it and talk about some of the technical options for heat decarbonisation. And then I'll wrap up with some next steps, and then Rob, not Owen, will be answering any questions that's been raised during the webinar. Okay, next slide, please. So let's start with what is net zero. For the last couple of years, in particular, sustainability has become less of the buzzword, and net zero is the thing that everyone's talking about. But what is net zero? And in some of the interactions we've had with clients, there's certainly been a need for a little bit of education in terms of understanding what net zero is. We've all seen various organisations declaring themselves to be carbon neutral, which only helps to confuse the situation, and in some cases, in my view, it's a blatant attempt at greenwashing. So let's get it straight. In terms of net zero, as far as the UK is concerned, it's about achieving net zero greenhouse gases by 2050. That's our target. That's set in stone. That's law. So we all have to achieve net zero by 2050 at the latest. Some organisations are obviously setting themselves more ambitious targets, which is great, and we're working with quite a number of organisations now with varying targets around that, and some include milestone targets such as zero carbon within their own scope 1, scope 2, partial scope 3, moving towards then full net zero by a different date. So hopefully everyone has a universal understanding of what net zero actually means. It applies to all greenhouse gases. It's often, I think, some of the confusion is where greenhouse gases of all types are often referred to as CO2 equivalents, not just as CO2. Next slide, please. So just to give a little bit of overview from a UK perspective, as I said, we've got to achieve net zero by 2050. And we have to, as an interim target, achieve a 78% reduction by 2035, which isn't that far away, is it? It's only 14 years, or less than 13 and a half years, actually. The government are producing a heat and building strategy, although that is yet to be finalised and to be published. But part of that also focuses on fossil fuel usage in domestic housing. And I believe that 14% of the UK's emissions originate from the housing stock. They seem to be pinning their hopes largely on decarbonisation of that by one, they've banned new fossil fuel boilers from 2025, which is only 3.5 years away. And they seem to be pinning their hopes largely on those being replaced with heat pumps. However, of course, today's webinar isn't really focusing on that area. It's focusing on industrial and commercial environments and how we decarbonise heat within those. And of course, in an industrial context, that's also about process heating, which is a bit more challenging than domestic space heating. As you can see, we've got a long way to go, particularly as gas is used for the bulk of heat, with electricity accounting for 12%. Gas accounts for 78%. So gas is the big challenge here, I guess, is to try and displace that. Next slide, please. So heat is either in scope 1 or scope 2, i.e. self-generated source of heat. Steam or hot water boilers would be scope 1, whereas bought-in heat would be, for instance, from district heating schemes. Heat used by an organisation's suppliers, however, it would be part of that organisation's scope 3 emissions, i.e. so it's their suppliers' scope 1, scope 2, but it is your own organisation's scope 3 emissions. Before looking at, I mean, we would say this anyway, for anyone considering investment in any sort of capital project. But we'd say, you know, look at system optimization and energy efficiency measures before diving into investing large sums of money in capital projects. And when you're considering any technical solution, you should very much take into account the impact on your own net zero journey and your ability to achieve your net zero ambitions. And lastly, I would say there are no silver bullets. We had a conversation yesterday with a large paper manufacturer who very much was pinning his hopes on hydrogen being their silver bullet. But in our view, and I'll leave Barnsley to talk about this in a little more detail later, we're quite a way away from hydrogen being that silver bullet. So you have to deal in today's realities, what's practical and what's going to actually work in the next sort of 5 to 10 years, and whilst keeping an eye on emerging technologies, of course. And next slide, please. And now I'm going to hand over to Simon Matthews to talk about commercial influences.
Thank you, George. I'll leave my camera off because I think we've got some problems with the internet and connections. But good morning, all. And my next few slides are really trying to set the scene for decarbonisation of heat, probably from more of a commercial aspect, and consider how that sort of those influences influence your decision making as organisations. Next slide, please. As we've heard from George, all organisations are now driving towards decarbonisation, and heating, if it be for industrial use or commercial space heating, is going to play an essential part across the UK and a challenge to all organisations. And in making those decisions from a commercial perspective, there's usually two influences or drivers that assist with that approach. One is high-level strategy, driven down from the board level or through an organisation to demand certain aspects and returns. And the second is more from a practical perspective, maintaining and ensuring that you've got technical and operational requirements are being delivered. But in the context of decarbonisation, and any change for that matter in investment, there's always a limit to cost. Next slide, please. So from a high-level strategy point of view, most organisations now have started to go on the journey to net zero and obviously set various targets. In reality, a lot of organisations have already set targets from a strategy perspective in terms of reducing carbon, so challenging how people operate their plant and equipment to generate heat. The strategy will also largely dictate, we need to make cost reductions, we need to make savings, how can you improve performance? And at the same time as making those challenges, it's improving compliance and maintaining security. So all organisations from a commercial perspective certainly have big challenges ahead, especially trying to invest in low carbon and decarbonisation technologies. And at the same time, trying to balance the sort of energy trilemma of maintaining energy security, energy affordability, and energy sustainability. Next slide, please. And in making decisions and operating systems, technical and operational requirements are key to any operating business, if it be for generating heat for steam or for space heating. And at the same time, always trying to improve operational performances to try and meet your high-level strategies. But at the same time, there's going to be pressures upon requirements to replace existing and aging plant, and decisions are required to be made at that point. What plant do I replace it with? And in the context of decarbonisation, it's important to start to think about how you can replace that plant and equipment and how it impacts on your carbon emissions. At the same time, we've, over the last couple of years, or certainly during the case of pandemic, all organisations are now facing changes in heating demand, largely because of use of space heat, use of buildings. And so again, it all becomes a challenge. So from what we suggest, and it's important, you've got to create a decarbonisation roadmap such that you can prioritise and plan. And I believe that's the best way to tackle this net zero journey. Next slide, please. So the starting point and the first steps, and as we've heard to some extent from George, is looking at the energy hierarchy. So ensuring the optimising your use of energy within your buildings, within your industrial site, to improve performance by optimising, turning plant down, making sure your set points are set correctly, and reducing your energy consumption, therefore reducing your carbon emissions to an optimum such that you're matching your thermal demand that is required for your site. The second step, obviously, is to look at improving efficiency. So in the case of heating in buildings, perhaps look at your building envelope, look at where you could improve the insulation, perhaps look at how you could improve maintenance on your plant and equipment to improve efficiencies, before going on the journey to invest in renewable technologies or low carbon technologies, which require significant investment and ensuring that you get it correctly sized at this point in time. Next slide, please. So in order to optimise your decarbonisation plan, it's important to set out a plan and prioritise. And by doing this, it's important to assess and understand exactly what plant you have got, how it's generating its heat, how it's using its energy, and so you can evaluate its CO2 emissions, and so you can set your targets and understand what your trajectory is. It's important to use metering information and monitor your consumptions over a period of time, such that you can make valid and sensible commercial decisions. Equally, it's also important to consider your future heating requirements, such that you can build that into any change, any investment you make going forward. By understanding what your current position is, you can start to prioritise. So you can start to improve your energy and CO2 performance. you can start to undertake those energy efficiency measures to ensure that you're not wasting your investments. And then you can look to replace the high CO2 emitters and replace your aging plant in an appropriate, planned and sensible manner. Next slide, please. What it is important to do, however, is to avoid the white elephant. We've seen a number of projects over recent years where the homework hasn't been done. Companies or organisations haven't fully understood what their heating demands are or their heating profiles, and such they end up installing plant and equipment that in 5 years' time or even immediately is not fit for purpose, not meeting the requirement. Especially when you're starting to go on the decarbonisation journey, it's important to make those decisions with a full understanding of what you're doing. Other aspects that's important to consider, especially with changing technologies, is the constraints and limitations. So make sure that if you need to obtain planning permission, you do so. And equally to understand what your electrical supply capacity is, especially in the electrification of heat. There's going to be challenges or constraints on your supply capacity, which could cause you to increase your grid capacity and therefore plan accordingly. And we, in the same way, I've seen a number of projects where design and development has gone considerably down the progress of implementation before someone's flagged up the fact that they haven't got enough grid capacity, and they've got to go back to the DNO and request further supply capacity, which impacts on capital clearly and time. Equally, the third point on there is if you're choosing something like biomass or biofuel and you're changing your boilers or your systems accordingly, ensure that you understand what your long-term availability for that supply of that fuel is. It's important that you don't install new equipment under a decarbonisation practice that ends up with no fuel in 5 years' time. Next slide, please. So from a commercial perspective and taking into consideration the drivers and the requirements of any organisation, clearly cost is the principal aspect. And it's important to understand what your capital budgets are, because they actually could dictate the actual solution that you choose. Because as we know, low carbon solutions tend to have higher capital costs than the conventional technical solutions that we're enjoying today. What is also important, and we very much stress, it's important to understand what the whole life cost of any project, such that you can build a business case, understand what the projected energy consumptions will be for the new technology, what the operational requirements are, and the service and maintenance. Things like biomass boilers, for example, will certainly require more operational input than perhaps a conventional gas-fired boiler, certainly for space heating. And in certain cases, it's important to, if you're evaluating different technologies and developing your decarbonisation roadmap, is sometimes set internal cost of carbon, such that you can judge different technologies in that way. Other things to consider, and we're still waiting for the government to really jump on board, but there are certainly opportunities or incentives and taxes. We know that in the public sector, there's the public sector decarbonisation scheme and grant funding that is available. And for heat networks, there's the Heat Network Investment Programme, which is going to transform into the Green Heat Network funding. But in due course, we expect the government to either impose further taxes on carbon or hopefully to develop incentives. So make sure you're aware of those when evaluating your cost and business plan assessments. Next slide, please. This slide just shows or gives an illustration of some typical parameters or metrics that we have evaluated over the last few months associated with capital costs and cost of heat, CO2 reductions for different technologies, and just gives a good illustration of how different the costs are with those low carbon solutions. Next slide, please. And what this what this shows is that, as we all know, decarbonisation of heat can be achieved, generally with proven technologies. We've still got challenges with high temperature requirements such as steam, but in the majority of cases, especially for space heating, low carbon systems through heat pumps can achieve greater than 70% reduction in CO2 and more efficient energy usage. But the big challenge we have, and currently, is that gas-fired boilers or existing technologies generally have a lower running cost from an energy perspective and generally have a lower capital cost. So when trying to convince boards to replace plant and equipment, it's always about thinking about the balance and the transitional period. So finally, just to suggest that the net zero is a journey. So what is important to set a decarbonisation roadmap and plan and prioritise your actions. Thank you very much. I'm going to hand over to George Barnes now, who will talk more about the technical solutions.
Thank you very much, Simon. Hi, George Barnes here, consultant with JRP, and I'm here to talk about the meaty part and get to the heart of the matter. So next slide, please, Rob. So we've touched on this already. You're very aware we need to get to net zero by 2050 with intermediate pressures and targets up to there, with the sixth carbon budget recently being released and other legislative requirements such as gas boiler phased out by 2025, requiring a bit of outside of the box thinking for newer builds. We know that heat is a massive challenge for decarbonisation. The electricity decarbonisation of the grid has been steady and has been effective, especially since 2014, as we'll come to look at over the next few slides. And each of these heat decarbonisation applications have their own unique problems. There's no one size fits all. Don't fall into the danger trap of those group of people in the bottom right corner seeing the heat pump evaporator and the heat pump system as the magical solution. There isn't one, and each heat using application will have pros, cons, and restrictions of each, and that's what we're going to explore in the following slides. Next slide, please, Rob. So this is a reiteration of the earlier slide George used to set the scene. I'm not going to focus on the top 3 bullet points, but what I will discuss is that heat accounts roughly for 37% of our total emissions from the UK. Admittedly, this is 2016, that analysis was done, but still rings true. And of that, around heating and hot water is about 20%, so remaining 17% roughly for industrial heat. And what we do know is emissions from buildings, direct emissions from 1990 to 2019 are in totality only 13.5% lower than they were. The majority of that is from the decarbonisation of electricity. Hence, therefore, that the decarbonisation of heat has become a massive challenge historically and shall be in the future. Next slide, please, Rob. What this graph shows is the energy and emissions projections from BEIS starting in 2019, moving up to 2040. You can see that renewable share of electricity generation by fuel source is set to increase even further. Natural gas decrease steadily up to 2030 and then plateau. Imports and nuclear set to increase, not dramatically, and coal flatlining with some carbon capture storage with natural gas. What this tells us basically is that the grid intensity, which is the emissions of CO2 associated with a kilowatt hour production of electricity, is set to fall even further, therefore making electrification a favourable option for heat from an emissions perspective. Next slide, please, Rob. What I've done here, I've gone through the DEFRA greenhouse gas emissions factors, which are published every year for compliance schemes from 2002 up to 2021, the latest emissions set published, and pulled out the grams of CO2e equivalent per kilowatt hour of electricity on the grid from 2002. So that y-axis is the grams of CO2 equivalent per electricity kilowatt hour produced on our grid. And what that does show us is from 2014, there was a dramatic fall in the grid intensity from around 500–600 grams of CO2 to where we sit today of just over 200. And it's telling us that for each kilowatt hour of electricity produced, electricity is now more efficient from an emissions perspective than coal, gas oil, and LPG, but not quite natural gas if you're considering direct combustion, and that's due to the inefficiencies of electricity generation from natural gas on the grid still. And the next slide, please, Rob. We can see that I pulled out a very crude projection using the last 3 years average reduction in grid intensity moving forward up to 2035. And that indicates that by 2022, 2023, the grid will, emission factor will have fallen below that of natural gas. So therefore, direct electric heating will be even better from an emissions perspective than natural gas. Quite a crude estimation. You probably expect that to be more of a staged approach, and I would assume level off at around 50, 60, 70 grams of CO2, even when the grid is decarbonised as much as it possibly can be. So next slide, please. So these are the issues that we assume most of you are facing. There's the issue of technology. Technology is an issue, but as Simon mentioned, it's lesser so than some of the others. You know, if you were to try and decarbonise your comfort heating, for example, you probably could do it. However, there'll be constraints on each of these technologies and limitations. It would very likely be expensive to do so now, and especially in the industrial setting, you'd have to think outside the box quite a lot, especially if using high pressure steam, for example. There's the issue of timing. When do you do this? Especially if you don't want to have a break in production, or if you've got high occupancy buildings, when do you rip out your main boiler plant and replace it with lower carbon alternatives? And then you've got the issue of buy-in. How do you persuade those with the purse strings to replace existing, for example, well-run and cheaply run natural gas-fired boiler plant with more expensive alternatives by developing examples, really strong business cases or putting on other strings. So there's the issue of buy-in there. And then finally, you have internal pressures and external pressures. You have the internal pressures of, for example, your group, your targets you've set science-based targets already, you have those pressures, and then you have your external pressures as well from potential clients, for example, government, media, etc. So they're the issues that we're trying to overcome. Next slide, please, Rob. And these are the options we're going to be looking at today, the actual technical appraisal. Not an exhaustive list by any means. We're going to be looking at passive heating first and foremost, electrification and alternative fuels, and then we'll have a bit of a view of outside the box or other ideas that aren't covered in there. There's a lot of information in these slides, and I do apologise for having to go through them in a relatively fast time. Please do ask any questions at the end or put them in an email afterwards, and we'll be happy to answer them. Next slide, please, Rob. So first and foremost, passive heating. The most efficient watt is that one never used, the old cliche, the negawatt. Passive heating is essentially just extremely efficient building design. We've all come across passive house and other examples of this, building in solar chimneys, large glass facades, and facilitating good natural convection inside to make sure that there's a balance of heat. The pros of this is if it's done really well, there's loads of no energy consumption, i.e. there's minimal input, mostly from the sun, and minimal maintenance because there's no plant to have to maintain, ideally. However, these solutions are very difficult, if not impossible, to retrofit, so it has to be done at the design stage. You can't put a green Lego brick into a red brick wall. You have to knock it all down and start again. So need to be done right at the off. And restrictions of these technologies are that the UK is very cold. You're likely to require backup heating and cooling, and if poorly designed, as covered in the cons, your building itself can be a big heat loss rather than a heat gain and store and maintain. So needs some very careful design considerations from the get-go. Next slide, please. So the big one generally is electrification. Heat pumps, how do they work? They're essentially fridges in reverse. So bearing that in mind, they use refrigerants. So a refrigerant is compressed and condensed. When that happens, heat is produced, that's then transferred to liquid or to air. That's then goes for the evaporation cycle. There's an endothermic cycle, and that absorbs the heat from the refrigerant, and then that is therefore either expelled or can be reused, as would have been in a fridge in the opposite way around. And the properties of refrigerants, generally when they're compressed, they have a 100% plus efficiency ratio. So for example, heat pumps, air source heat pumps have a general efficiency of say 300%. Ground source and water source can be up 400, 500, 600% efficient, or electricity in versus heat out. And therefore they are extremely, not extremely, but much lower running costs than direct electric heating, for example, and associated lower CO2. So if you cast your mind back to the grid emission factors, so that's the emission of electricity, so divide that by 3 or 4 for the 100% plus efficiency effect. Heat pumps also have low maintenance. You can generally plug in and play, a bit like air conditioning systems with leak tests, but generally they kind of do their thing without having too much intervention. And they can be 100% clean if that electricity is generated on site from guaranteed renewable sources or a direct line PPA. We're not talking about having green contracts here. We're talking about direct electric generation. Cons of heat pumps then. So the higher the heat output and the lower the heat input, the less efficient the heat pump is. Heat pumps like stable source of heat inlet as well. So hence that's why ground source and water source heat pumps have higher efficiencies. They have higher heat input temperatures and they're more stable than air. You're likely going to require retrofit. So heat pumps like to operate at lower outlet temperatures, normally around 40, 45 maximum. So if you've got a traditional wet system with a 65 C operating temperature, your radiators are likely going to be far too small for a heat pump system, and therefore you're likely going to have to rip out all of those radiators and start again. So that's a consideration. These heat pumps are also noisy. So if you're thinking about installing them in a residential area, for example, you need acoustic testing to make sure they reach the limits. And they contain F-gas. F-gas is fluorinated gases. Fluorinated gases are basically an interchangeable term for refrigerants. And these F-gases present their own problems. They have generally high global warming potential. Global warming potential is GWP, which is the equivalent warming potential of these gases in relation to carbon dioxide. So a ratio, carbon dioxide would be 1. There was a GWP of 2000 for one of the refrigerants. That means it's 2000 times more warming than carbon dioxide. Another con is the non-domestic renewable heat incentive finished to new applicants this May. And this was a big price supporting mechanism for retrofits especially. And that will affect the business case now of new heat pumps. So restrictions being space, these systems require quite a lot of space. They need, especially if you're doing ground source heat pumps, for example, they'll need a big area for the heat pump coils. They'll also need space for the evaporator fans and the condensers inside. You need a good, stable, high heat source. Also, the buildings, you don't want to be really putting on heat pumps into non-tight buildings due to the low-grade heat from the radiators. If you have got a leaky building, those buildings are going to struggle to come up to temperature, if at all, compared to a higher flow heating system. Simon alluded to the planning permissions, and yeah, I fully agree. I worked with an organisation in central London a few years ago where they were operating out of a listed building, and their idea was to convert fully to air source heat pumps. But due to the planning regulations, they weren't allowed to because of putting all the evaporator fans in the building. So they had to go down the direct electric heating front, and which is a very, very costly solution. So planning permission is a consideration. And finally, supply capacity. Someone also alluded to this. If you're putting a few megawatts of electricity supply to the local network, you may be likely to pay for the reinforcement of said network, which is very expensive. We're talking tens, hundreds of thousands of pounds. So check with your DNO, your district network operator, before doing so. Next slide, please. This slide here illustrates another commercial consideration. it's showing that generally we wouldn't suggest fully sizing a heat pump installation for worst case scenario of heating a space. So for example, if designing to -15, we'd recommend supplying around 50% of that heat by heat pumps, with the remaining being supplied by topped up by gas, because 50% of the capacity generally will allow for 80% of your heat requirements throughout the year, and then the extra 20% top up. Reason being, heat pumps are expensive, they require lots of space, etc. So therefore, from an economic perspective, it makes more sense to install the majority of your heat load from heat pumps, but not the total amount. Next slide, please. Here's the F-gas slide. I mentioned earlier, I'm not sure I alluded to this, but it's deliberately very busy because there's quite a lot to think about when selecting the right refrigerant for your heat pumps. On the top right hand corner, that's that GWP, the global warming potential. So R404A, or about the fifth one down there, that's the traditional refrigerant used for a heat pump. And as you can see, that has a GWP of nearly 4,000, so 4,000 times as warming as carbon dioxide. And on the right hand side, you can see, has it been phased out? So these refrigerants are being phased out under EU law over the next coming years. And R404A has been phased out, so therefore you can't buy any of this on the open market anymore. It's only recovered and recycled. So supply and demand is getting more expensive to get these refrigerants, and you can't get them at all by any means for some. So therefore, the right selection from both a GWP perspective and from a buying perspective is important. We also need to think about the safety. So safety being flammability, safety being toxicity. A lot of these refrigerants are flammable. So if replacing or thinking about replacing, for example, R404A with R32, which is another common refrigerant for heat pumps, you couldn't do a like-for-like swap, because R32 is much more flammable than R404A, and it could likely catch fire in the system. So therefore you'd have to do a complete replacement. So that's a consideration, especially when thinking about retrofitting F-gases. And then finally, some of these F-gases are toxic. For example, ammonia, second from bottom on the chart there, yeah, another considered toxicity. And recently, if you want to know any more, I've just published an article which we'd be happy to share about F-gases. Next slide, please. So here, one of the newer gases to be used as a refrigerant. So it's been around for a while in the larger capacity heat pump areas, but on the smaller systems is CO2. And CO2 is a very good refrigerant for higher temperature processes. So generally heat pumps operate and can only operate at the lower levels and lower temperatures. CO2 can operate at 65 degrees C plus, so therefore can be used for hot water generation, and can also be used for retrofitting existing natural gas boiler plant or oil boiler plant, for example, if you have a flow temperature of 60, 70, 80 degrees plus. Not necessarily incredibly efficient in comparison to the lower level heat pumps if operating at the high temperatures, but still nevertheless it is possible. A nuance of CO2 as a refrigerant is that it prefers a large temperature drop across the condenser, so therefore it prefers a lower inlet temperature with a relatively higher outlet temperature. So if you're thinking about using the CO2 as a refrigerant in closed loop domestic heating systems, you should try and really use as much of that heat as possible in the circuit before coming back into the heat pump itself. Another consideration of CO2 is it has very low global warming potential. As we discussed, GWP is based on a CO2 equivalent, with CO2 being the lowest. It's non-toxic, it's non-flammable, and it's not ozone depleting. So CO2 has obviously a very bad rep for emissions, but as used as a refrigerant, as you can see, it can be very useful indeed. And it's unlikely to be prohibited in the future due to its low global warming potential. So you will have none of those supply issues, hopefully. Next slide, please. Cool. We've gone back to the beginning. That's fine. I'm not going to discuss these slides. A few more. A few more. Next. That's it. Thank you very much, Rob. So this is an example of where a heat pump system has been installed to extremely efficient measures. In Budapest military hospital, sewage water was used as the heat source. I mean, it's a secondary transfer medium, so you wouldn't be putting that straight into your system, but it would be that heat would be transferred to the refrigerant, and that has a stable temperature, which heat pumps like, if you remember, and a high temperature of between 10 and 20 degrees throughout the year. This matched with a low outlet temperature of just 32 degrees and large heat transfer mechanisms made a very efficient system of a COP, or an efficiency of 650 to 700% for every kilowatt hour of electricity in versus kilowatt hour of heat out. So it just shows, with careful considerations and design, these heat pump systems can be extremely efficient. Next slide, please. So on to direct electric heating. It's not preferable, but it has its place, as for example, that organisation I mentioned earlier with the restrictions on planning. It's got lower associated CO2 emissions currently than, for example, LPG or oil or coal. So relatively low CO2 emissions in direct point of use. Again, can be 100% clean if generating renewable electricity on site. They generally have a lower installation cost, so a wall mounted radiator will cost you 150 quid to put in, and you plug it and play and leave it going, compared to some of the higher installation costs of other technologies. Direct electric heating can be a good heat sink if you're trying to balance your, for example, if you've got a solar array on site and you don't want to install a battery, you can use the hot water in the heating system as a heat sink there, and use that as a hybrid system. And one application where direct electric heating is actually quite useful is in infrared heating. That being the case because infrared heating heats the person or the object, it doesn't heat the space. And therefore, if you've got big drafty warehouses or halls or thoroughfares, infrared heating is better than other sources of space heating. Cons of direct electric heating: CO2 emissions are low, but they're still not as low as natural gas when directly combusting. They're not as efficient as heat pumps, and they are expensive to run. Electricity has historically been expensive. I'm not sure if any of you have been affected by the recent price hike post-pandemic of electricity, but wholesale costs have risen dramatically. We're talking nearly doubled, and you're very much likely going to be seeing that effect being passed on to you, if you haven't already, soon. So therefore, electric heating direct is very expensive and likely to be so moving forward. They will require retrofit. They're generally individual units. You're not going to be able to install them with existing plant. And they are decentralized, especially if you're talking about wall-mounted heaters. So you've got a lot of different pieces of plant to maintain. So if you've got 100 to maintain, there's quite a lot of PPM, planned preventative maintenance, involved in that. And finally, the main restriction on direct heating is the supply capacity again. So if you're, for example, installing 102 kilowatt heaters, that's 200 kilowatts worth of heating going onto the grid. If you're talking to the thousands, then you're talking megawatts. So if you're installing large arrays of direct electric heating, you'll really need to consider how that's going to affect the supply capacity and check with your district network operator. Next slide, please. So alternative fuels. First and foremost, biomass. Biomass wood chip has a bad rep generally. I wouldn't say it's not deserved, but that's not because of the technology. It's because of the way these technologies have been commissioned, maintained, and operated. As a principle, biomass burners can be very effective. They're carbon neutral, technically, if you have a good heat source and you're just taking out as much from the air as you're putting in, if not more, and then burning from woodland that wouldn't otherwise have been created. So technically, with that logic, they are carbon neutral. Can be relatively cheap fuel compared to oil, for example, and electricity if you're direct electric heating. Cons being renewable heat incentive again is gone, and this was a big price support mechanism for biomass boilers. And we're not entirely sure what's going to be replacing that, if anything. There is talk of a upfront CapEx grant, but only to the maximum amount of £4,000, which is negligible compared to how much renewable heat incentive these pieces of plant would have been receiving otherwise. Again, alluded to earlier, operational management and niche maintenance, they're quite technical pieces of equipment. So maintenance isn't as simple as plug in your gas boiler and let it run. You need to maintain the insides, the burner, the auger. There's quite a lot that needs to be regularly maintained. And you need someone to manage them operationally, that the wood source needs to be checked and stored regularly with moisture content constantly monitored. Deliveries, for example, need to be sorted and stored, and it's a bit more management than would otherwise be for electric or gas or oil alternatives, for example. Biomass boilers have high installation costs. There's no getting around that. They're generally 2-3 times that of a gas boiler, so that needs to be taken into consideration. And the main restriction here is the supply source. First and foremost, the quality. So you need to make sure you've got high quality dry wood chip or pellets, otherwise you're going to be constantly maintaining your boiler. It's going to be breaking, for example. I worked with a client not too long ago who had just installed a 50, 60, 70,000 pound boiler, and they got the cheapest supply source of wood they could, which contained metal and bolts, and lo and behold, ripped through the boiler within a matter of months and was never used again, and was completely money down the drain. So supply source quality is of the first and foremost consideration. And then the supply source, where does it come from? How are you getting it? So if you're taking into account the whole life cycle emissions of a biomass boiler, you don't want to be getting virgin hardwood forest that you're chopping down and importing from overseas, because that's going to only exacerbate the problem. You want to be looking at ideally getting locally coppiced managed woodland in the UK, or really good high quality waste wood. And then you also need to be considering how long are you going to be getting that wood for. So locking in a supply contract for a good length of time, preferably for roughly the same amount of time you foresee having the boiler. And finally, storage space is a restriction. If you're in central urban areas and you need to store large amounts of wood chip, you're going to struggle. So probably not a suitable application. Next slide, please. So biofuels, very similar to biomass. They have similar considerations, similar pros, similar cons. Pros, again, can be carbon neutral for the same principle as biomass, and relatively cheap in relation to direct electric heating or oil, for example, if sourced well. Another pro is currently they can be used as a blend or a drop-in for a kerosene alternative, especially from a blend perspective. It's thought that up to 20% of HVO or RME, HVO being hydrogenated vegetable oil, or RME, rapeseed monoester, can be blended with gas oil, kerosene, and put into conventional boilers. But do check with your boiler manufacturer before you do so, evidently. And there are studies going on where I live in Cornwall currently. There is a local community that has replaced its kerosene fuel with HVO, hydrogenated vegetable oil, and they have had no issues whatsoever. It's been going for about a year. So therefore the application does work on a smaller scale, but there's nothing larger scale on that ilk as of yet, but hopefully in the future maybe so. And I put AD gas there as well. So AD gas, anaerobic digested gas, generating gas from waste feedstock, for example, food or sludge or other waste materials, and utilising that gas in a boiler it is a great option if you can. Quite unique and quite niche applications and operations for doing so, but especially on larger manufacturing sites. I've seen a few of these, for example, cheesemakers, where they utilise this very well, and also working with a cider company currently to investigate. So good for the manufacturing side. Cons, again, renewable heat incentive. I keep rattling on about it, but I'm quite put out by it on my soapbox. That's gone. So CapEx may not stack up. The business case may not stack up. Sorry. You may need a new boiler. I mentioned you could use some of these blend drop-ins, but your likelihood you could need a new full boiler, so that's going to be expensive. There's also the operational constraints and considerations of delivery. So there's emissions associated with that and the management of doing so. And finally, you're going to need somewhere to bunker this fuel on site. So if you're in an inner city location with limited space, bunkering may be an issue. And so finally, supply source, main issue, same with biomass. There's been stories recently of biofuels being mixed with 50% non-sustainable palm oil. And also we've got the monoculture cropping issue of soya, for example. So if you are to go down the biofuels route, make sure you know where your fuel is coming from. Next slide, please. Finally, on the alternative fuels slide, probably the most contentious of all of the fuels, hydrogen. You may or may not have seen that the government recently released its hydrogen roadmap last week. And general consensus is that 10 years at a minimum, I would say, before any sort of hydrogen is available for commercial use properly. There's industrial sectors where it's being trialled. And on the industrial vein, I would personally envisage that hydrogen would mainly be used for industrial processes, so steel, cement, and high pressure steam, for example, potentially the decarbonisation of transport. However, I wouldn't hold your breath for using hydrogen as a comfort heating source, at least not for a very long time, if that's the way you want to go. But nevertheless, it is a good fuel. You know, you can't knock hydrogen in itself. It's got no point of use emissions. It's got low to no associated emissions if made correctly and well. So through electrolysis, if made for renewable electricity, it's got no associated emissions, or with good carbon capture storage. It's very abundant. You're not going to run out of hydrogen. It's the most abundant element on our planet, so it's not going anywhere. And one of the big pluses is you can retrofit hydrogen burners to existing boiler plants, especially in the manufacturing sector when you're using natural gas currently, where that is such an issue in the future potentially when you're looking to change that boiler plant, especially if you're using steam. On the same vein, if you're retrofitting to existing boiler plant, that's going to require minimal behaviour change and minimal adaptation. So another pro. Cons, the technology is not generally widely available, especially for larger boilers. It is in niche applications, but not generally. It's expensive, the plant's expensive, and the fuel's expensive. Steam reformed methane hydrogen, which is the grey hydrogen, which most of hydrogen in circulation currently is about 5 times more expensive than methane. Methane being gas, so therefore gas is 5 times cheaper than hydrogen. It's an expensive fuel, and if getting through electrolysis and carbon capture storage, those prices are higher. Another con, it's flammable, it's dangerous, it's hard to handle. See in the bottom right hand corner, that's a refueling station in Sweden a couple of years ago where hydrogen storage did not go well and there was an explosion. I don't think anyone was hurt, but it just highlights that it needs to be treated with care. And in the hydrogen strategy just published, I think I did a search for safety and it came up about 75 times. So obviously of the utmost importance. Restrictions, so supply source. I personally would not know where to go to get enough hydrogen to heat a medium-sized office block, let alone a large industrial scale site. So at the moment, obtaining hydrogen at any cost is very difficult. There's no infrastructure there for distribution. There's plans for the national grid to rework some of the the grid potentially, to hydrogen capacity in some of the niche sites closer to the industrial sites, but there's no real infrastructure there at all yet, and there's only plans. So currently no distribution network. And the timescales for all of this to come to fruition, as I said, 10, 15 years, I would say, personally, on my head, if at all. So don't hold your breath. Next slide, please. Finally, on the technology side, district heating, not necessarily its own technology, but a mixture of these. District heating is a centralized plant, an energy center that contains a mixture of combined heat and power plants, biomass, energy from waste, for example. That's then distributed through a network of pipes, and you pay a set pence per kilowatt hour for connection to the network. Pros of this being that generally, historically, these were low carbon or lower carbon heat source than localized natural gas plant, for example, because they employed these lower carbon technologies that weren't readily available. And if they don't or didn't, they can easily be retrofitted to low or no carbon heat sources in the future. Another pro is that they are operated by a third-party system, so you don't have to worry about any of the maintenance or the operation. And included in that, because they're operated by a third-party system on a large scale, the operational costs are generally lower than if you were going to maintain your own plant. Cons being generally expensive at point of installation, therefore that can be reflected in the pence per kilowatt hour cost you pay in the long run. They generally have higher system heat losses because they've got the large distribution network for heat to be lost through. And I've got the third-party system now as a con as well, because although you're not liable to maintain or operate the plant, you're therefore not liable to maintain or operate the plant, and you have no say on what's going on. So once you pay that pence per kilowatt hour, it's basically out of your hands. Restrictions on district heating then are the timing. When do you connect to the network and rip out your existing plant? When's best to do so? And the location of the network. If you're situated far away from the energy center, there's going to be potentially lower grade heat coming to you, and also with the long distance, the lower efficiencies in getting that heat to you as well. Next slide, please. So finally, on the technological side, other options, thermal solar PV, I haven't included that because I couldn't fit it in any of the other considerations. Nothing wrong with it at all. It's a good technology, especially for usage in hybrid systems by heating water sent to a centralized buffer tank and then used in a combo system. Deeper geothermal. So if you have a look to the bottom right there, there's an illustration of varying heats from varying stratas in the earth. If you're lucky enough to live in the northeast or the southwest, that's even more increased due to the bedrock of granite and other rocks. So you've got potentially a decent heat system there for you. Mine water energy as well. Disused mines that have been flooded are generally a very good heat source. So if you're near any old mining communities, that's worth investigating. Smaller scale CCS being carbon capture storage. Carbon capture storage, again, quite niche, currently under development for large scale projects, nothing really for smaller scale. When I say smaller scale, I'm talking energy center size, big CHP units, CHP combined heat and power units. Maybe in the longer term, in the 10, 20 years, I've read a few papers suggesting that it can be done, but something for the future that may or may not happen. In the nearer term, a replacement for oil, if you are on oil heating, movement to LPG or a blend of biofuels in the short term could be an option, not a long-term solution, but as we mentioned, this is a journey and it could be an intermittent step for you. And finally, hydrogen-ready retrofits, not waiting on hydrogen itself, but installing boilers that can potentially be combined with hydrogen in the future with a dual burner. Especially I know with people who are replacing steam boiler plant now, they're thinking about retrofitting with hydrogen-ready burners. So that is a potential option if your plant's going to be there for 10, 15, 20 years. Next slide, please. And that's essentially me. In summary of what I've said, the most efficient what is that never used. It runs through the theme of the whole webinar. Make sure your plant is, or your building is, as efficient as it possibly can be and airtight prior to any retrofit or replacement of heating. The technology does generally exist. If you want to decarbonize comfort heating, you could, but it's expensive, timely, and has other restrictions. Less so potentially for manufacturing. It takes a bit more outside the box thinking. Each application is unique. There's not one size fits all. There's going to be a combination of each of the technologies. It's thought that electrification will potentially account for maybe 50% moving forwards as a rough estimate, but then that other 50% of heat decarbonisation needs to come from somewhere else. So that could be the biofuels, it could be the hydrogen, you know, it could be one of the other outside the box technologies. So think outside the box, and the final takeaway message is commissioning is key. Don't leave stranded assets, don't leave white elephants, don't install expensive complex plant and then put in poor supply contracts or poor maintenance contracts and waste a lot of money. That's it for me. Thank you very much. Lots of information there. Please do ask questions. Please do get in touch, and thank you for listening. And I'll hand over to George now.
Thanks, Barnsley. As you say, lots of information there, that's for sure. Can you move on to the next slide, Rob, please? That's great. So where to next? So in terms of decarbonisation heat, obviously there's lots of options there, and as Barnsley rightly said, some are more affordable than others. The technology is there, but it might be cost prohibitive at this time, or at least some solutions are cost prohibitive at this time. Hydrogen is quite an interesting one, as Barnsley said. Some people consider it to be the silver bullet. It's, for me, it has fantastic potential, but I worked at BP 20 years ago and we were looking at hydrogen then, albeit for transport, and they basically chose not to develop it much further. Of course, they'd probably ruin that decision right now, I'm sure. But it's interesting. Hydrogen has lots of issues associated with which George outlined. One interesting application that someone was talking about a couple of weeks ago to me was for a large hospital, because obviously one of the byproducts of creating hydrogen is oxygen, and of course hospitals use a lot of oxygen, and particularly during the recent pandemic, oxygen was in short supply in some areas. So you know that could be another added revenue stream and bonus byproduct of on-site production of hydrogen. But I guess that's sort of something to just keep a watchful eye on, as we will very closely. We watch for developments in all technologies and advise our clients accordingly. But in terms of next steps, obviously carry out an appraisal of your current system. You know, how fit for purpose is it, particularly in the net zero context? What are your current O&M costs? How efficient is it? And of course, you know, what are the current emissions? Have you done the best with it in terms of optimizing the system? All too often we've been asked by clients, come on site, right, we're looking for a replacement this or a replacement that. And quite often the case is the fact that the system's fine, it's just not being used correctly. It's not being operated, maintained, it's not being controlled correctly. So sometimes it is a question of just evaluating that system and making it work for them, and avoiding having to spend out lots of money on replacing a system that's in actual fact fine. But it does get to a point when it's not fit for purpose, and then obviously it's time to then investigate alternative systems. And when you do that, it's not just about looking at what the use of that system is today, but what the use of that system going forward. So net zero particularly and decarbonisation is all about strategy. It's not about short-term tactics, and it's a bit of a cultural or mindset shift for organisations having to consider their decarbonisation strategy. It's a strategy. It's long-term, so you're having to think sort of 10, 20 years ahead. Whilst net zero 2050, our target to achieve that as a minimum, seems a long way away. It requires strategic thinking. So look at it in the long term. Heat pumps seem to be sort of the obvious choice for many applications, but as Barnes has outlined, there's lots of pros to them, but there are some cons. So you need to consider all alternative systems carefully in terms of space, in terms of planning where required, and in terms of their suitability for your particular application. You also touched upon district heating, electrification of systems, and some of the pros and cons of those, as there are for all systems. Solar, fantastic. Thermal solar, of course. But it is, as Barnes said, there's no one hat fits all solution. So it's very much looking at your own circumstances, your own projected uses, your own restrictions, and of course your own budgets, and indeed your net zero aspiration. So generally speaking, of course, the sooner you want to hit your net zero target, at the moment, it's there is a cost to doing that, quite clearly. One of the things that might help you when you're looking at the options is to also set an internal cost of carbon. That helps the organisation to view investments in an entirely different way, because there's no doubt about it. We touched upon earlier the rising cost of delivered energy in this country, which is about to hike up again. Wholesale prices have leapt, so therefore that will inevitably feed through to the delivered cost to everyone on this webinar. And so delivered energy is going up. The cost of carbon, direct and indirect, is going to increase. And it's sensible, therefore, if you're looking at 10, 20-year investments or life expectancy of any investments, then you should be taking into account carbon. So why not set a cost of carbon? That will certainly help with the business case for investment. And looking at alternative delivery mechanisms, irrespective of the actual technology that's being installed or that you're considering, there are alternative delivery mechanisms there. You don't have to invest your own capital. There's things like energy performance contracts, power purchase agreements, utility management agreements, where third parties will, under a contract, invest the capital required, install the technology, and operate and maintain it throughout the life of the project. Of course, there's pros and cons to that as well. The pros are obviously that you're avoiding investing your own capital, that you're offsetting the risk or outsourcing the risk to another. But as we and our clients have found, these are quite complex arrangements, or can be. And if you've not negotiated these agreements in the past, you're best getting a third party expert in. I'm happy to say that we have bags of knowledge and expertise and experience in this area, having worked with a multitude of blue chip organisations. We're currently working with a number of organisations who are looking at replacing their existing CHP plant for operational reasons rather than to help achieve their net zero objectives. So we're working with them to identify the right solutions and the right suppliers, and then we'll help them to negotiate the right performance agreements and supporting O&M agreements as well. So if you go down that route, yeah, it's a good alternative to investing your own money, but tread carefully and seek expert advice. And that obviously feeds into the next stage, which is the contractual stage, which you might have the right technology, chosen the right supply partner, but it can all go horribly wrong in the contractual stage. So as I say, seek expert advice. Even if you think you know everything, I'll guarantee you that there will be things that will in the future bite you in the backside if you're not careful. And the same goes for the implementation phase. You know, that needs to be managed carefully, because you can have the right technology, but if it's installed incorrectly, then it could give you problems in the future. So again, if you don't have that project management expertise, seek outside expertise. It's an area that we're helping a number of clients with at the moment. So that's an area just to be a little bit careful of. And verification, this is something that, disappointingly, we find so many organizations don't do. So they've gone through all the effort, all these previous steps, they've done all the right things, they've invested their own money, or they've invested through a third party, and they don't actually verify the performance of the technology that they put in place, or indeed the contracts that support them. So really important to verify the performance. We're IPMVP practitioners, or a number of us are. IPMVP, for those that aren't familiar, is the international protocol for the measurement and verification of projects. It's a bit of a mouthful, I know, but it's the first recognized international standard for the verification of projects. So it's worth making sure that they're doing what they should be doing. And if you have a performance agreement in place, then critical to that will also be having the right level of metering. So you've got the data upon which you can then verify the performance of that particular plant, equipment, or project. Next slide, please. Thank you. So that's it from me. Before we move on to the to any questions, which I know Rob's been monitoring as they've come in, we'll answer some of the key questions. But as I said, there will be a recording of the webinar made available, and we will also provide everyone with a copy of the questions and the answers in the following days from today's webinar. Probably be sometime next week, I would imagine. So all questions will be answered in that way if they're not answered today. So Rob, can I hand over to you for the questions? And then I suggest probably in the main, it's looking at them, it's likely to be Simon or George Barnes that's going to be answering them.
Yep. Okay. So we had quite a few questions come in. The first one is using purchased electricity from renewable sources off-site for space heating an acceptable strategy for net zero?
I mean, for me, it depends if you're doing it in the right way, how that's being purchased. I mean, if you've got a direct line with a power purchase agreement coming fed into your facility, then 100%. If you're talking about just purchasing green contracts and green electricity, I'd say it's not necessarily the right way of doing things, because essentially you're just drawing electricity from the grid and you're responsibly purchasing that electricity and encouraging a market. So yeah, twofold. If you're directly purchasing with a direct line from a site, then yes. But if you're talking about just buying green electricity contract, then no.
Yeah, I'd just like to add, interestingly, green gas is also considered an opportunity, and we've seen a number of organisations who actually have invested in developing biomethane, I suppose, through an AD plant, and then purchasing or offsetting their use of gas in a CHP or a boiler based on what they've actually generated through their AD plant. So but I think it's taking responsibility for your own usage and consumption from a green perspective, both electricity and gas.
Okay, thanks. The next question is, do the panel believe that there is sufficient planning to increase generation capacity to provide the necessary additional energy to operate carbon capture and storage facilities that industry will install to meet net zero by 2050?
I think the simple answer is probably no. I don't know if you can. I think, yeah, the UK government have got to put pressure on various parties and stakeholders to understand that. We know that there has been an emphasis on potentially looking for hydrogen, but as George has outlined many times, hydrogen is is some years away, if at all, and will be expensive. So I think the reality check is that we need to be considering alternatives and infrastructure accordingly.
I think there's a long way to go with the infrastructure. We're going to probably see a doubling of electricity capacity needed over the next 10, 20 years. And it's not just the capacity, it's then the grid reinforcement as well. And if we're talking about government strategies, how to do this, I'd say that there's not one that I've seen that's in place.
Okay. Next question. Can heat pumps be used for cooling as well?
Simple answer is yes. Absolutely. And in fact, if you combine heat and cooling in a renewable low carbon system, it probably makes a lot of sense economically.
Okay, next question. What typical lifespan do you expect for an air source heat pump in the UK climate?
Probably 15 years, but equally we've seen examples where air source heat pumps haven't lasted 10. So it depends on where it's installed. Because a air source heat pump is installed out externally, then it depends on the local climate as well in terms of how that impacts on the asset itself. But I think that the simple answer is because air source heat pumps haven't been installed in the UK for any length of time, no one's fully sure of what the realistic lifespan of those units are. Anything to add, George?
15 years is about spot on, I would say, if well maintained and looked after. As we said, commissioning with maintenance contracts is the key. But yeah, much longer than your traditional boiler plant.
Okay. Next question. Do you see more potential for technical innovations in heat pumps apart from refrigerants?
I mean, potentially. I'm not a designer of heat pumps. So I don't know what I don't know. I can't see why not. The efficiency of heat pumps are improving year on year. But yeah, I mean, Simon's probably more than I on that.
I think probably the answer's got to be yes. I think we've seen obviously the deployment of heat pumps over the coming years is going to significantly increase. I know that Boris Johnson's 10-point plan stated that there'll be 600,000 heat pumps installed each year from 2028, which is a significant number given that we're only installing less than 30,000 currently. But heat pump manufacturers are putting a lot of time and research into improving performance. So it will improve. But yeah, like George, I'm not involved intimately in how these have been designed and developed.
Okay, next question. What do we know about social cost of carbon projections, and how can this balance the OPEX increase due to shift to electricity as a heating fuel?
Sure if I fully grasp the question. It's quite a complex one with many threads. So the social cost of carbon projections, I mean, for me, with the lower carbon projections from electricity, therefore social costs reducing through emissions and harmful diseases from particulates, etc. I can see as being a good thing. I don't know if I've misinterpreted that, Simon.
No, I probably can't add much. I think, as George says, it's quite an integrated question, but we'll consider that response, I think, appropriately.
Yeah, I think it might take a bit of time to unpick.
Okay, and one final question then. Is it worth generating electricity from waste heat?
That's a broad question. As a twofold, I'd say if you're talking about electricity from waste, burning waste, then intermittently until we no longer require it, then yes. If you're talking waste heat from, for example, CHP and steam turbines, then also yes, if you've got it in the nearer term. Simon, anything else?
No, not really. I think the answer is yes and yes, as you say, both those sort of applications. But equally, it's understanding what the commercial benefits are.
Okay, that's it from me.
Thank you.
Back to you, George Richards.
Thank you, gentlemen. That was really good, and thank you everyone for your questions and your participation in what was hopefully been an informative almost hour and a half. As I say, we will issue all the questions that have been raised today and the relevant answers. There will be a recording available of today's webinar as well. So it only remains for me to thank everyone for your participation and to thank the presenters for their very valuable input today.
Thank you, George. Thank you everyone for attending. Hopefully you found it useful.
Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Bye.
Bye.